Alright, welcome. So if it's the first time we're meeting, my name is Wenlin. It's so great to have you here. I'm a yoga instructor and yoga teacher trainer, originally from Singapore, now based in Turin, Italy. And today I'd like to share a little bit about how you can use some tools and resources to be able to efficiently plan and manage your time well so that you can plan your lesson plans and actually save time doing lesson plans for yoga. And some of these principles and tools actually not just apply to also your classes, but also in general for planning workshops and other things as well. Yeah. Just give me a second as I set up. All right. So if you are tuning in live and if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comment box and I'll be able to answer them live at this time. And this talk will be about for 30 minutes. Just to start off, I wanted to share a little bit about my planning process with regards to teaching yoga. So if there's any of you guys who are tuning in live, pop and say hello so I know that you guys are there. Okay, I think some of you guys might still be streaming in. Okay, so maybe I can share a little bit about my planning process for yoga first. So when I started off as a yoga teacher, how I began planning my classes was usually I had a notebook within which I wrote most of my lesson plans. So if you don't already have a way of documenting all where your past classes are, you don't have some form of whether it's a hard copy or soft copy, form of documentation for your classes, I would highly recommend to have that in place. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of the classes, because depending on what style of yoga you teach, whether it's vinyasa flow, hatha, yin, there's usually a general structure in place. So if you're still undergoing yoga teacher training, you might be quite new to this. And for myself, since I teach mostly vinyasa flow, as well as yin, I'll use these two as examples. So just starting off with vinyasa flow, usually there's a structure in place, right? And I learned this from my own yoga teacher training as well as from asking my yoga teachers whom I really respected and that I looked up to as mentors. So how it usually begins is there is a setup, there's a phase in which you get the students to come in, to ground down, to center, and then, hi Monica, hello. And then you gradually get them to do a little bit of a warm-up for the body to get them to center inside the body, and followed by a sequence that gets them familiarized with whatever journey you want to take them towards. And then you lead them on to, for example, maybe a peak sequence or peak pose, the end point, so to speak, of wherever you want to take them. And then after that, there's usually a cool down followed by shavasana and maybe meditation. So that's usually how I structure my classes. And for this general flow, right, what I do is I plan segments. So as I mentioned, there's usually the centering. Usually the centering I would pair sometimes with a theme of the class, with a quote, with a mudra, and that would be segment A. And then there's segment B, which is the warm-up, or I call this the spinal mobilization, as you begin to take the spine through the major degrees of freedom. So the spine has 6 degrees of freedom. So there's flexion, there's extension, there's lateral flexion, and then there's twists, right? So just to get them to mobilize the spine, mobilize the major joints in a couple of areas. So you warm up and lead them on that segment 2 or segment B. And then you take them through the main flow. So for a lot of the teachers, right, they would do something like sun salutations, A or B. For myself, I usually don't like to do sun salutations. I like to mix it up and do something fresh. But the sequence is something that you can always then recycle and reuse, and that's segment C. And then for me, I usually build on to that sequence and add on with taking them through to somewhere like a peak pose or, you know, a certain part of their body, maybe the hip area, or maybe today we focused on the shoulders. So that's the general process. And then for the cool down, again, I have usually segments or chunks that have become like my plug and play. And then there's the shavasana. So if you follow this sequence and you have a general structure in place with, say, 5 main segments, very much like a report that has 5 main areas, or a book that has 5 different chapters, what you can do and what you can do by saving time is having those chapters in place, and then over time you can recycle and reuse various different chapters. Maybe say for chapter 1 or segment A, you have 5 different kinds of chapters, right? Maybe work on the shoulders, maybe the theme of today is humility, maybe you choose to work on the seasons, right? That would be chapter 1, and then you take them throughout everything else. And then it's the same for every single segment or every single chapter. So if you are familiar with permutation, right, and if let's say we multiply, right, let's say for every single segment you have 5 different types of variations. So 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, that gives you an infinite number of possibilities. Hi, good morning, Tisha. Of possible classes that you can teach. So like the possibilities are really like endless. So this is my first tip for you guys today, to see your class planning as having segments or chunks, right? And it's easy to have no worries, Rebecca, hello, hi, good morning, to have these chunks, right? And then you can plug and play them in the respective area. Of course, they should flow nicely from one area to the other, but this is the general tip that I want to share with you, that you can begin to see your class as having different chapters or parts. And when you plan each part separately, and then you have a record of that part, you can then recycle that later on for a completely different class. So you don't have to plan from scratch. Right now, for example, there are maybe say 3 or 4 ways of warming up that I usually like to do, and then on the spot, if someone asked me to teach something brand new, I could just plug and play, maybe warm up A plus maybe sequence 1 from like a part B that I used to do that I really like, and then this leads on to peak pose C. So, and then of course this comes with experience, but if you take this approach or this mindsets to planning your classes, it will really streamline and save the amount of time that you are planning, instead of thinking, a class on the theme of, let's say, Stira Sukha, which is effortless ease, has to be this entire class, which starts like this, and then it ends exactly like that. No, so today, that's the first thing I want to invite you to think about, to segment your class into chunks, and each chunk can be recycled. That's the main thing. So the second thing that which some of you guys might have missed, because you joined in a little bit later, was that I asked a question, how do you guys currently now document or plan your classes? Is there a book that you write down, or your lesson plans, or do you have it in, let's say, a soft copy version? Do you use an app, or do you use a website? Feel free to share in the comments so that I can know how you guys are documenting. Okay, so I'll just wait for your comments to stream in. I guess you guys might be on the later part of the video. So there are various approaches and resources to actually use to document. And if you don't already document every single class that you teach, I highly recommend to do that. Okay, it doesn't matter, it could be on a sheet of paper. I'll just show you. So for example, sometimes when I'm teaching a completely new class that I don't already have an existing format for, I just write it on a sheet of paper, and then later I transfer it into a book or journal or onto an Excel sheet, right? So Tisha, you mentioned you write it in a journal, and that's great. It makes it easier to refer to. So you don't already have a hard or soft copy way to document, I highly recommend, please get started, right? For every single class that you teach, you must document it and make it, like, schedule a time. It doesn't have to be right after the class. I mean, whenever that is, please archive all your classes, right? And I'll explain a little bit more about why it is important to do that later on, right? Okay, so there are various ways of archiving. So it can be in a hard copy form, like on a sheet of paper. It could be within a journal, like a book, like a small notebook that you can keep with you, right? You reuse chunks, right, Monica? Great idea. No class is the same. And then another possibility is to use a website or apps. So one website that I used to use in the beginning when I was starting out as a yoga teacher trainee it's called To and I'll share that in the group later on, so you guys will be able to have it, and I'll also send that across to email if you guys want to sign up for To. That's a free website, and I think they also have an app version that actually shows the visual asanas, right? A little icon of this person who's doing an actual pose. And then you can plan the actual sequence and see it visually. So if you're a little bit more visual and you need something to actually see, right, that is a good way to do it. There are also various, for example, cards that are available on eBay or, for example, on Amazon that you can use, like playing cards to actually sequence. And what some teachers do is that they use the cards and they lay them out visually so that you'll be able to see, okay, this pose flows nicely into this. And then you take just a photo of that later on and okay, that's the class for today. Right, and the last one, which is a tip I use myself, which I figured out because I used to work as a researcher and I love Excel spreadsheets, is that I document my classes on Excel spreadsheets, right? And it's because for myself, I find it super helpful, and you can scroll across and see and compare across different classes. Okay, for this class, what is the theme? What is the peak pose? What is the associated mudra? What is the associated pranayama? In this warm-up, what do I include compared to something else? And then I can easily shift and copy and paste things from one class flow in one column compared to the other. So if you don't already use that and you are open to and would like to try, I'll share that across as well in the email, so you receive it in the newsletter. There's a free template. You're fine reviews for Q class yesterday. Yes, I can send you, Rebecca, I can send you a recommendation for one that I have tried in the past, and you can have a look at that and see if that might be something you want to use. I know that some teachers also use phone apps, right, that help them to plan. So it's a little bit similar to Me, but it's in the phone version. So you can have it on your phone, you can do it on the go while you are maybe say waiting in transport between classes. Or like, let's say you don't want to use your laptop and you prefer to use your phone. Yeah, so these are some of the practical resources that you might be able to use. Okay, and then let me talk a little bit about why I think it's important to document your classes. Because as Monica mentioned, she also reuses classes, right? And I think that for a lot of yoga teachers, especially in the beginning, there's this feeling that, oh my God, every single class has to be the same, right? You feel there's this I would call it illusion, or this feeling that you know, whenever I teach a class to a student, I cannot teach the same class again, right? And this means that you have to spend a lot of time planning new classes, right? So another tip that I offer you, so the first tip was to chunks, right? To begin to plan your classes in chunks and then recycle. Second one is to document your classes. The third one that I would like to share with you guys is to change the mindset that every class has to be different. Okay, and let me talk a little bit more about why it's okay to teach even exactly the same class, right? So if and when you begin to teach like a group of students, what you will begin to realize over time when you approach them, especially if they're beginners, is it takes time for them to learn things, right? And what happens when students keep doing the same flow is that they begin to notice their progress. And if you observe, right, in many of the major studios, right, lots of the studios will actually have a fixed sequence, and they call it maybe their signature sequence. In a studio where I used to practice as a student, they had a flow called like the home flow or whatever it was. And actually as a student, I loved it. I went to the class and I knew, even though it was different teachers, I could expect exactly the same class. I knew exactly what's going to happen in the flow. And in the beginning, as I was beginning to learn the flow, it helped me remember, okay, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I knew this followed by this, and it gave me a sense of confidence as I was beginning to understand, oh, this is what the flow is like. This is what it feels like to progress from this pose to the other pose. So for beginners, right, especially if you're working with beginners or if you have a group of say regulars whom you are trying to take them from one step, maybe say they're not even beginners, they are kind of like halfway in between, they already know some basics, but you're trying to take them to build, let's say, more arm strength, right? And you want to take them towards getting their first chaturanga or their first headstand, tripod headstand, that you need that strength from the arms. So it might actually benefit to get them to do the exact same flow that you plan with that intention of taking them to a specific place, right? So that with every class they gain that familiarity, and then they feel that, okay, and after the third class, after the fourth class, they can feel the difference. They can know the difference inside their body, and you can see the difference as well. Right, so this is why I highly recommend this approach, and this is why every class does not have to be the same. Right, even if the students look like they are feeling bored, you can explain the rationale to them, and I would tell you that actually they would not be bored, right, at all, really. And this is something that you can try to explore. Okay, the next tip I like to share with you is, if you're not ready for this approach and you feel like, I'm not quite sure if my students would be okay with every single class being the same flow, a tiny tip, right? Okay, you can teach exactly the same flow, no problem, same sequence, but have a different focus for the sequence. Let's say, okay, we do a flow and the flow always builds up to, say, crow pose. Pretty difficult pose, right? But every time you teach the flow, maybe say in the first time you teach the flow, instead of focusing on actually flying, you tell them to focus on releasing weight to receive support from the earth. And then the second time you teach them the flow, you tell them to focus on the sensation of squeezing towards the midline. The third time you teach them to move towards the peak pose of crow, you tell them instead to look ahead and focus on the drishti for that day. So every single class is the same, the flow is the same, but how you convey the message, how you guide them towards what to focus on, where to listen inside their body, and what to look at, what to pay attention to is different. So their experience of the journey will be different. So in this sense, it saves you a lot of time for planning. You don't have to come up with a completely new sequence. It's always the same sequence, but today you focus on emphasizing this aspect as compared to something else. Right, this is the ultimate tip that lots of experienced teachers use. And even right now as a teacher, right, I recycle my sequences, and sometimes I teach the complete same flow, to the same group of students within the same week, and they love it because it's a different experience, right? Okay, I'm just reading your comments. Tisha, yeah, your husband, yeah, mentioned started practicing yoga. Yes, exactly. Especially for people who have just begun practicing yoga and are not so familiar, which is what many of your students might be like. Having the same flow is actually really great. And I want to talk a little bit more about this, actually elaborating on that, because if I think back to my experience as a beginner and when I was following the same sequence, what I liked was that when I progressed from so-called a beginner within the sequence towards becoming an advanced practitioner, it was almost as if I could anticipate what the next pose was before the teacher said that. Right, so I'll get to that later on. Now I'm a little bit different because right now I'm focusing a little bit more on teaching teachers, so I don't no longer do the same sequence always. But as a beginner, that gives beginners confidence. And it gives them a sense of assurance of they know where the path is going to lead, and they can move there with confidence, and they can get to the pose and then feel the pose and be in the pose and absorb the benefits of being there with their breath and their body for much longer, instead of like, oh, what's the next pose? Oh, downward facing dog. Oh, it looks like this. And then like, okay, three-legged dog, I have to raise my leg up towards the sky. And then, you know, it takes quite a lot of bandwidth, especially for beginners. Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. By having, exactly what you said, Rebecca, by having the same flow, it reduces the amount of mental load that beginners or those who are newer to yoga, that they have mentally in their mind, so that they can focus more on being in the moment for each specific pose, for the entire journey that you take them towards, right? And depending on how you emphasize different aspects of the journey, their experience will be different for every single class, right? And so this is my last tip for today on how to save time planning lessons. Actually, I have one additional tip. But I wanted to pose a question to you guys first. When do you actually plan your lessons, and how long do you take planning your lessons? So what's your current approach? Do you set a timer? Is there a specific time of the day? How long before you're going to plan a class do you start planning? I guess there's a little bit of lag, so I don't see any comments yet, but maybe I can share a little bit more about my own experience. So in the beginning, as I was starting off as a yoga teacher, I used to actually take quite a fair bit of time planning classes, right? And my personality is a little bit more perfectionistic. So in my mind, I would have like the perfect sequence. I would spend, say, you know, the week researching, finding inspiration, and then I would end up spending actually a lot of time teaching and like just planning the specific class, and I wouldn't actually limit myself, right? Exactly. Okay, Tisha, you mentioned that you would have to practice it first, right? Monica used to use around an hour, now you use a few minutes and plan it in your head. Perfect. Exactly. So as you progress as a yoga teacher, right, beginning, you might find that you need more time to plan it out and you have to practice it first, and that's perfect. Even now as a yoga teacher, especially if it's a sequence that I've not tried yet, I would usually have to work it out on the mat first. So what I do is I have my own practice, right? And actually your own practice sets the foundation for what you're going to teach. So if you don't already have a daily practice, the last additional tip that I have for you is to have a daily practice. If you don't have time for a daily practice, have a regular practice. 3 or 4 times a week. It doesn't need to be long. It could be 30 minutes, 20 minutes. Just make it a habit, put it in your calendar at a time that you can actually make it to practice yourself. And this doesn't, okay, you can follow a class, but I would recommend actually, even at the beginning right now, to start practicing on your own. Just play some music that you like, you enjoy. It could be just silence if you don't like music, and move, right? Start to cultivate as teachers the habit of listening inwardly and feeling the pose and moving inside your body, so that you can experience what it's actually like to move towards a journey. And usually for myself as a teacher, what I've found is as I moved away from attending classes as a student and instead focus on spending more time to listen inwardly and listen inside for guidance as to what possible journeys that might be to take my students, I've come up with more and more interesting journeys and things to offer my students. And I know it works because I tried it in my own practice. So that's the last tip for today. Okay, wait, Tisha, you mentioned you're like me, between planning, right? It takes a long time to plan, right? aside from this last tip of having a fixed timing, or like some time for yourself to practice, right, physically, right, the other tip would be also just to try to keep it simple. I know I already mentioned this in the previous episode on confidence, but I think the KISS principle, or keep it simple silly principle, is so important, because as a beginning yoga teacher, there can be many things that you want to focus on. You might want to put in mudra, you might want to put in pranayama, then there's meditation, then there's the peak pose, and then you also want to like emphasize on the anatomy. But really, that might be too much, right? You might just pick like 2 to 3 things you want to focus on, and make the lesson plan on that. Okay, so maybe say this week you feel really inspired by a quote that you read in a book, then let the quote lead everything else, right? And take some time and to be on the mat just by yourself, thinking of the quote, and move, feel. Okay, as a yoga teacher, as a practitioner of yogas, which poses embody this particular quote? What kind of pranayama puts the body in the state that resonates with what the quote is trying to share? And how would it feel? What kind of peak pose would take your student towards the journey so that they can feel what it's like to be in this quote? You know, so that is the final tip, I think, that I would like to share with you guys. Yeah. Do you guys have any other questions or anything you would like to share with like the other viewers who might be watching or listening, tuning in to this? Because actually, I feel like yoga teachers, right, we all have a different process when it comes to planning lessons, right? And as you become busier and busier, right, if you want to see yourself as a yoga professional, naturally you will start taking on more lessons. Naturally, you will begin to see more clients. Right, and you want to share more with your clients and make that a perfect experience. But if you're a true yoga professional and you begin to notice that you have limited time, right, you want to maximize how you're using that time. So another tip, okay, there's so many tips again. So the final tip that I would have is to actually limit the amount of time that you spend doing your classes. So there's this principle that is the 80-20 principle. So there's 100% of your time, and actually only 20% of what you do or amount of time that you spend is actually going to matter. So that 80% could be, you know, tiny things that make the experience like really good. But actually, right, for the class, you know, for the experience for your students, it doesn't really matter whether it's really good or really good, right? You just need to focus on that 20%. And for you, for every single teacher, it will be different. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the webinar, because as a yoga teacher and when teaching people, right, there are so many different aspects of your voice, of the sequencing, of anatomy, of peak posing, of using yoga philosophy that you can spend your whole lifetime to refine. And there's just no time for you to incorporate everything into your class. And if you do, you won't have time for yourself. You won't have time to succeed as a yoga professional, because time is limited and time is money, right? If you want to do well as a yoga professional, you got to value your time. So set a fixed amount of time for yourself. Put a deadline. So I really like doing that now, and just say, okay, I'm going to spend 15 minutes doing this. I will spend 20 minutes on the mat trying out the sequence. If it works, then great. If not, I have a backup, and that's it. And that's it for this week, for this schedule, and for this class. And I'm not going to spend more time, because my time can be better used doing something else. All right, so that is my final tip for today. Okay, let me see. Tisha, you had a good question on how to define the peak pose, right? This is a really great one. So the peak pose can be likened to a climax within a book. Right? Let's say you read a book and you want to take your students, right, or the reader towards a journey, towards something that embodies what you feel would be the theme of the class, right? Let's say it's connecting with your heart, Okay, so usually connecting with your heart is connected with the heart chakra, right? So anything, any pose that is relating to the heart could be considered a peak pose. Traditionally, or in terms of sequencing, some teachers like to use peak, like more difficult poses as peak poses, but I have used very simple poses as peak poses before as well. I just don't tell the students it's the peak pose. Right? I just know that, okay, it is something that requires some preparation in order to reach there, and it might take a while. So I, gradually take my students on this journey, so eventually we reach there, and that, it is accessible to them. This in my heart and how I define it is a peak pose. Something that is like a climax of a journey, but you need to progressively guide your students on that journey and take them through step by step so that they can reach there. Examples of peak poses include arm balances like crow. Crow is very difficult. It requires engagement from the core. It requires overcoming fear to take flight. It requires a substantial amount of engagement from the arms, right? From the shoulders, serratus anterior muscles, from your, if you know how to engage your Uddiyana Bandha and Mula Bandha, that also helps. Other forms of peak poses include back bends, like wheel, like even bridge could be an option. Bridge is a lot more accessible than wheel, and you could make bridge just the peak pose. And for some people, it might already be too much, right? And then for those of your students who feel that, there's nothing, I'm not feeling anything, you offer them the option of wheel pose, right? What other peak poses? Many people like to use headstand. Many people like to use other arm balances like side crow, like grasshopper. I myself have used other poses like wow thing as a peak pose. Even things like side plank or forearm plank could be a peak pose, as long as it's something that's kind of sufficiently challenging to your students, not to you, your students, right? Have your students in mind. Right? And that would be a peak pose already. Like somewhere where you want to take them that pushes them a tiny bit, but then it is still accessible to them with your guidance. Right? Okay, I'm just reading your comments. Rebecca, you mentioned you like the idea of starting with your own home practice, right? Exactly. If it is one thing that you remember from today's session, I highly recommend to have your own home practice if you don't already, because it forms the bedrock of what you can offer to others. If you don't have a home practice, your cup is not full, right? You have to, as teachers, we have to fill our own cups first so that we can share. If your cup is empty, it's gonna be hard to share, right? Begin with yourself. Fill your own cup first. From that inspiration, from that feeling of knowing what it's like in your body, then you'll be able to guide others better. Right? And I think that's it. I'll be able to share with you guys the resources that I mentioned. I have an Excel template that you guys can use if you don't already and you want to start to try documenting your lesson plans. That's very helpful. And then for the two other things, there's a card deck that you might be interested in getting if you're a little bit more visual, and then there's To Me as well, and I'll send all the links to you guys. It'll be in the email that will be out tomorrow, and I think I'll post it in the chat as well. Okay, yeah, anything else you guys want to share? If any questions, feel free to let me know. Yeah, if not, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you guys will join me for the webinar for this Saturday. So that's happening 2 p.m. Italy time. I think it's 8 a.m. in the US, and it's a little bit later in the evening in Singapore. All right, so take care, have a great day, evening, afternoon ahead, wherever you guys are, and yeah, I'll see you guys on Saturday.